Some time ago, I decided to pursue my dream of becoming an artist and came up with a plan and a study timetable to teach myself how to draw. I had recently graduated from university, and it was a time of exploring all of the options that I had available in terms of what to do with my life, especially regarding my career, as now I felt that I had much more control over what was happening instead of just doing things for the sake of doing as I had done with my studies. Unfortunately, just after the first 2.5 weeks, I ended up giving up on my plan. And the sad part is that this is not the first time that this has happened, as many times before through the years, I have made plans and I have made timetables, and each and every time I ended up failing. Every single time, I also felt the same feelings of failure, shame, and the feeling of not being good enough. All that this negativity does is to bring me down a self-pity hole from which it's actually hard to get out. The timetable was made for 7 weeks, and the goal was to study the whole of the human artistic anatomy, starting from the eyes and going all the way down to the feet, with each week being dedicated to a different topic. So on week 1, I was going to study the eyes, the nose and the mouth on week 2, the ears and the skull on week 3, and then moving on to the body parts from week 4. So the torso, arms, hands, legs and feet, and until I would be able to draw the full human figure. The 2 hours of daily study were going to further be divided into a 20-minute warming up exercise, followed by 50 minutes of studying from a book or a video lesson, and finally, after a 10 minutes break, another 50 minutes of practical work. The timetable started on the 10th April 2023, and at the beginning it was actually not hard at all. It was mostly stuff that I had already done in the past, so it was more of a revision than actual studying. As the week was going by, I was following my plan step by step, and also dividing the 2 hours into smaller bits of revision, studying, and then practice was proving to be very much effective. By midweek, I started to study the anatomy of the eye, and this was quite the highlight for me. During school times, when I studied science at school, I had studied the anatomy of the eye, but I never applied that concept to my drawings, and perhaps that explains why my eyes always looked like a blob, like there was no variation into it. I was always seeing the eye as just one single element, and that's how I represented it. Every time I would see a photo or a person in real life, their eye for me was just one single element, and that's how it would go down on the page. And it is quite funny because in my head, during the science lessons and everything, it's quite common sense that the eyes are a ball and they are lying inside the eye socket, but I never viewed the eyes during my drawing through that perspective, through that lens, and that's where I was going wrong. And when I found out that this was the problem, I was actually quite angry with myself because I had been stubborn and always thought that the guidelines and all of that stuff that you can't see is not important, when I now know that it's the most important thing. And if you can get that right, so the structure that lays underneath and you can't see, if you can get that right, then whatever you put on top of it will automatically look good and be in perspective. And even though it meant to having to forget what I knew before and to replace it with a new methodology, it was worth it. It was worth it to take that step back and to relearn and to accept a new, much easier, but at the same time much complicated way to draw the eyes. As I said, by the end of the week, I was actually really happy with myself, and it was a huge boost in confidence to know that I could actually sit down and confidently doing something, knowing what I was doing, instead of just randomly pretending to know what was happening and hoping for the best at the end. On week 2, I moved on to the nose and mouth anatomy, and once again, everything was much more easy to draw once I had studied the anatomy of these features, as everything all of a sudden made sense, and I knew why these features were represented in the way that they were, thanks to learning about their functions and also knowing their muscle and bones structure. During this time, I also started to make use of some apps on my iPad, and I used these apps both in my studies but also as posing references for when I was drawing. And I think that it's important to implement something similar into early work, especially because the mind is still getting used to the new words, to the new concepts that we're putting into it, and it's helpful to have some blank references around. And here I'm just sharing 3 of the apps which I personally use, and I think that these are quite good. The first one, I use it when I have to draw faces or portraits, as it's quite detailed, and the other 2 are the whole of the body and the muscles and the skeleton. When I was starting to learn about the mouth anatomy, so 1 week and 4 days after since the beginning, I actually started to missing out days, and this started with 1 day, but then it spiraled down into 2-3 days, and it really impacted my motivation to actually carry on with my work. At the beginning of week 3, I was feeling a bit hopeful and I thought that I would be able to catch up on the missed days. But as the week was going on, I started to question my self-discipline, and because I ended up having more than 6 hours of work to recover. And the hardest part was to acknowledge that there was no reasonable excuse for my behavior, as I did have the time to do my work. I just ended up wasting so much time. And then I just started to question myself whether I was just burnt out, or perhaps just that the topic of the mouth was not that interesting to me. And then at one point I was even questioning whether this was my real calling, my real passion, what I wanted to do. Realizing that trying to recover the lost hours meant falling further down on the timetable, I decided to move on as per schedule, and I was just trying to not lose motivation at this point. During this week, I ended up missing 5 days in a row, but I did pick it up at the end by studying the topic of the years, and I did complete that successfully. But the mouth was the one that had been missed out, and I just thought that I would add another extra week before I would go on to the body studies. But as hard as I tried, by the end of this week I did end up failing my own plan. And the worst part was that I could have recovered, but I just let it go. I think at that point it was just easier to give up, and that's what I did. Now, even though I did fail my study plan, this did not mean that I gained nothing from it from the previous 2 weeks of intense study. And I actually had developed quite a few good habits. And one of those was the ability to break down the complex structure of the face and even of the single features, such as, for example, the eyes, down to the simplest elements and forms, and then drawing those as an interpretation of what I was seeing. This ability was new to me, and I do definitely need a lot more practice on this. But here is an example of a work which I have completed straight after those weeks of study. And I think for the first time I was drawing something with a purpose, and instead of repeating the same patterns over and over and ending up with something which was out of proportion or just looking the same as it did in the past, I actually ended up with something which I was proud of. Comparing the illustration which I have made now to these two which were made a few years back, I can see the clear difference. In this picture, I know what I'm doing and know the different parts and how they all connect together. But in the old photos, I would just draw what I was saying and the parts were all melted together. Now, the sad reality is that I did give up too soon. The total plan was for 7 weeks, but I did only about 3. It's important to acknowledge that there was improvement, as I've shown in the previous illustrations, starting from 2012. and it has been more than 10 years since that first drawing. And the reality is that I know that I am not still as good as I could have been if I had put the right amount of hours and effort into doing what I was doing. So I do still feel disappointed in myself, but at the same time I do not want to beat myself down and just letting the negativity affect me, but I want to know why this continuously happens. And I have come up with 13 answers for this question, and the whole purpose of this is knowing what I'm doing wrong to be able to improve on it in order to make it easier for myself to achieve my goals. Number 1 is my bad habit of blaming others or outside situations for my own personal problems. So since 2014, when I left art school, I have blamed parents, teachers, and other situations instead of accepting that it's in my own hands to do something about it if I want to do it, and there's nobody actually really stopping me. But it was much easier just to say that this was the situation and I'm just going with it and it's not my fault. Number 2 is my lack of self-discipline. So I'm really good at making plans and making timetables and also mentally preparing myself with a lot of motivation. But when it actually comes down to sit down every single day and build up a habit, I am not good at all, and I end up giving up at the first difficulty. For instance, I found this video from 2020, and here I'm still learning the basic of art theory, and it's really disappointing to know that almost 3 years have gone by and I'm still there at that point. Which brings me to number 3, which is lack of consistency. So there are times when I feel intense bursts of energy, when I feel like I can do anything that I've set my mind to, and then there are times when all I want to do is just lie down and do nothing. And it's okay, we all get those days, but it realistically shouldn't get into the way of my work, and especially it shouldn't make me give up if I let it go on for too long. Number 4 is one of my biggest problems, and it is doing too many unrelated things all together all at once. For instance, in the past 6 months, I have been doing all of this together: studying artistic human anatomy, studying French language, trying to research and to launch a small business, studying web design, learning how to sew and embroidery, and finally also studying graphic design. I have no comment on this apart from that doing too many things all at once sometimes can mean that you end up doing nothing at all in the end. Number 5 is lack of focus, and for me this is doing things like daydreaming, thinking of the outcome instead of doing things, about how it's going to be in the future instead of focusing on the now. And this is a bad loophole to get into, because then my mind goes on to find excuses for my procrastination and for what I'm doing wrong. It has all of the excuses ready. Number 6 is setting myself unrealistic workloads. In the plan that I showed in this video, I had set myself the goal to study the whole of the artistic human anatomy in 7 weeks, and comparing that to the art of masters who have taken years and years and sometimes even decades to get where they are at, my plan looked like a joke. And then again, I do empathize with the fact that it was just the beginning and there was much more room to improvement, but at the same time it's quite scary and it's too much for the brain to handle, putting so much new information into it. Number 7 is that I'm impatient to get to the end every single time that I start a new thing. If it's a video, if it's a course, if it's a book, anything, I would just want to get to the end. And then once I reach that point, I do not know what to do next. Because the journey is the part which I'm supposed to be enjoying, I end up missing all of that. And this comes into the form of taking all the notes and not doing practice, taking in as much information as I can, but not doing anything practical about it. Number 8 is starting from zero every time I fail, and this is getting new notebooks, new resources, making new timetables. But it's always better to keep on building on the knowledge that you have previously gained, so you can keep on building and building instead of starting from zero every single time, because it can get quite boring, and I usually lose motivation even before that I've reached something new to learn. Number 9 is disorganization and too much clutter into my workplaces. Having to clean up my desk before I actually sit down to draw is already 2 tasks which I have to do instead of 1. And as funny as that sounds, my brain sometimes just tell me to just let it be and not do nothing at all about it instead. Number 10 is never completing what I start, and this is quite scary because it's almost becoming a mindset of mine, and it's almost as if it's part of who I am, and I'm beginning to accept it that I'm never going to complete anything that I start, so I don't even try. Be it a course, a book, or anything, I always get excited at the beginning, and then by the middle I end up giving up. Number 11 is letting my emotions affect my productivity. And yes, we do all get bad days, but I believe that if there is something that you really want to do with all of your heart, your feelings or emotions shouldn't come in the way of your achieving your goals, especially if it's something temporary, because missing one day will lead to missing 2, then 3, and then by the time you realize that you've missed all out, it will be too late. Number 12 is lack of confidence in myself. So I always find myself seeking validations from others that if what I'm doing is good enough, but I never give myself the opportunity to evaluate and respect my own choices, because I always think that other people's opinions matter more than mine do, and I think that's a really toxic mindset which I need to work on to be able to break free from it. So number 13 is having an unclear purpose and not knowing why am I doing what I'm doing and what's the purpose behind my desire to become an artist. Why does it matter? With that, I come to the conclusion of this video. I am quite proud of myself that I was able to self-reflect and analyze what was going wrong all these years, and hopefully I will be able to tackle all of these things that I've come up with, and I will be able to solve these, and I will be able to improve much more effectively than I have tried to do before. So for now, thank you so much for watching and have a lovely day.